So, Kevin, I discovered you from your paper, which was titled The Consequences of AI Hype. So what are the consequences of AI hype for those people that haven't read your 2023 paper?
Yeah, I would say the big consequences are consumers over-rely on AI because they think it's some sort of superhuman thing that'll be right all the time, which we know isn't true. And so the consequences are they get screwed up on when they try to use AI, and then they over-rely on it. And for businesses, the consequences are similar. Businesses that over-rely on AI and believe the hype about an AI tool often also jump into relying on it or adopt it really quickly without doing due diligence. So a couple things need to happen in general. One is companies have to reduce the hype about their own AI, which they don't want to do, because if I say that to somebody who's a business person that has made an AI model, they'll say, but mine deserves hype. And, this is why I'm big in favor of regulation. I don't want to slow these guys down, but right now everything's going so fast and so willy-nilly that I think it's a threat to human society.
I was watching this podcast with you in preparation for this interview, and in this podcast, you say, quote, "I quit my job at the university in part to have the freedom to do this kind of stuff. If they heard this podcast, I'd have trouble keeping my job." I mean, what do you say that's so controversial that you couldn't even say in the university, academic setting that you would get canned for just you having the audacity to use your voice to have some concerns about AI?
Well, I'm willing to consider using AI for the right purposes and carefully. And I was always interested in trying out new technologies. That when I made that statement on Alexander McCaig's podcast about 2 weeks ago, and I was talking about the history of my use of technology in the classroom in the 90s. I was an English professor with a strong interest and background in technology. That didn't make me popular. English departments are very retrograde. They don't like technology because they worship old-fashioned books. And I was trying to move students past old-fashioned books to use online books that were free. Publishers don't like that. English departments don't like that. They want them studying, the musty paper. And I also was trying to use certain tools to see how they would perform in the classroom. The big one I talked about it in that podcast was a online chat program that was only able to be used in a small local area network because they didn't have strong internet back then. This is back in 96, 95. And when my colleagues would watch my class to evaluate me, they would always get nervous, and they would say something at the end of their observation like, "So do you think this kind of technology is going to take over our jobs?" And I would always say, no, there's no way that online chat can take over a professor's job. But it sort of demonized me in the eyes of the department. And if I said controversial things like we should read Shakespeare online instead of buying a $200 book, a lot of my colleagues would have been scandalized. So anyway, now that I don't teach anymore for an institution, I can say whatever I want.
Yeah, as a former college student, those textbooks you're always buying are fairly expensive. And one of the tricks I would always use was I would just buy the older version. And in my experience, I just assume you have the professor goes on a sabbatical for a year to write a book, and he's probably making some profits from the books. I would just buy the old textbook for $5 at the time on Abe.com or Thrift Books or something like that.com or eBay.
And you could get it even cheaper if you bought a used textbook.
Well, yeah, they were all used. Yeah.
Yeah, somebody had highlighted all this stuff, but if you just ignore that, you get all the same information.
Well, I would even have like classes where they would eliminate some of the chapters, but then the teachers would deem them chapters important. So then no one actually had any text to it, so they'd have to take notes where I had the actual text in my older version in that chapter, whatever. I always just thought it was like kind of ridiculous.
Well, at least you're one of the few, the few and growing fewer students who actually read texts. A lot of my students knew the end. If it wasn't video, they didn't want to do it. And I'm an English professor, so it's not like I can skip reading assignments in classroom. I did, though, do something, and I'm going to make a prediction here and stick my neck out. Back in the 18th century, back in the 1700s, the novel was invented by various English writers, and they're typically females and written for females, and they're considered schlock because real writers wrote only about the Bible and they wrote poetry. That's it. So it was considered lowbrow stuff, but now the novel, 200 years later, is considered the peak of fiction and peak of sort of writing civilization. But I think what's going to happen is video games are going to be the same thing. 200 years from now, they'll be looked at as the newest narrative invention. And it's considered schlock by most professors, but I don't consider it schlock. I think that the narratives built in a video game are very interesting, especially across 5 iterations of the same game. I'm thinking of Halo and games like that. Now, here's an example. What I just said would probably get me fired from a number of university English departments. But I'm telling you, the video game is the biggest development of the 21st century, and it's going to be noted as such in future literary scholarship.
We're recording this January 30th, and I believe it was Monday of this week, we had the big news about DeepSeek. And so obviously I don't think we can discuss a podcast with AI without breaking out the whole DeepSeek, news. Is this a game changer for the AI industry? I mean, a lot of the markets are drop-ins, NVIDIA and everything else. And I mean, you're talking, you're AI ethicist, so this definitely could be a game changer for your profession as well.
It could, but I consider it another case of AI hype. I think that, what happened with DeepSeek is that the Chinese company that made it on the back of American models with open source software. And what it teaches you is that the American, especially Silicon Valley culture, has overhyped our own AI as something so unique, you need to plow a lot of money into it. I think what's going to happen is American developers are going to stop plowing as much money into our AI models. Because what we've learned is DeepSeek shows that you can use older chips to make the same thing. It just depends. And you can use open source software to make the same kind of thing as ChatGPT at a fraction of the cost. So the thing that's going to get hurt by this is the market for the Magnificent Seven, the so-called Magnificent Seven companies that control the technology world. Things like companies like Amazon, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and so forth. NVIDIA's stock took a deep dive, which it deserves because they overhyped their chips, which are not really needed, as DeepSeek shows. So anyway, I think this is another case of AI hype that's gone wrong. American companies saying, our stuff is better than sliced bread and nobody else can come close. So you better use our product to make your apps. Well, DeepSeek showed that's false. You can make apps with DeepSeek for a lot less money.
There are multiple questions like, is China and this whole DeepSeek being honest about what they've released? Some people say, of course, that they were actually using, more advanced chips and what they let on, and that this company actually had this as a primary focus, wasn't just some side project. And then also just like, well, if when we want to talk about, having regulations and slowing down progress, well, if you regulate it and slow it down, like say in the EU, well, then you're still going to have Russia and China and India and the US advancing full force. So how do you tell certain actors to slow down while other actors are not? And then the US, where they released, was it like Stargate, where they're talking about $500 billion, and then all of a sudden China comes out like, well, actually, yeah, so it's more hype, and then China comes in and dashes the hype. So it sounds like it's kind of like a strategic timing of it. I'm with you. I've done a few podcasts on the hype, and people are like, oh yeah, like that hasn't aged well. I'm like, actually, I think this has aged better than than you'd think it has. I think the hype has just gotten more and more as I'm not saying that AI doesn't have useful capacities, but talking about, was it Sam Altman a few years back was talking about right now, 2025, that 90% of jobs be wiped out. I mean, come on, we're not 90% of jobs being wiped out.
Yeah.
A complete hype.
Well, I agree with you 100%. It is way overhyped, and the people who run these companies overhype their products. They do it on purpose, I'm sure that some of it's optimism, and they mean what they say at times, but I think the rest of it is just pure marketing. Another good example of that is in my article that you read on AI Hype. I talk about Tesla's autopilot. It's not autopilot. Autopilot is what you have on a plane. You press a button and you just leave it alone, and you can go get a snack, in the back. The autopilot for Tesla's cars is far from that. You got to pay attention or you end up dead. So that was a clear case of conscious hype by Musk. And there's a ton of articles I read that back that up, where he said he absolutely refused to call. People in his company wanted to downgrade the name so that it would not give people the wrong idea. He was adamantly against that, and he made it autopilot. And then a bunch of people died and sued him. So, that's where we stand with that. But yeah, I have a whole book on intelligent technology's effects on jobs, put out a couple years ago with James Hughes, who's a sociologist at UMass Boston. So we talked a lot about this stuff, about what we thought would happen to jobs, which is what I use Joseph Schumpeter. I have an economics degree as well. So I use Joseph Schumpeter's theories about, or observations really, about creative destruction. His theory of creative destruction was that in past industrial revolutions, which there have been 3 of, every time what would happen is the new technology would wipe out a bunch of jobs. But then within a generation, about 20 to 25 years, the people who were raised with that technology would create twice as many jobs as got wiped out. So essentially what's going to happen, I predicted, is that there'll be a lot of jobs wiped out in the next 20 years, but eventually we'll all be okay because new jobs will come up. One that's already coming up, I'd say within the next 2 years, maybe 5 at the most, will be prompt engineering for AI. NYT, after I left, started a prompt engineering program where they teach you how to write prompts that are efficient and that draw out the information you really want. And I think that's the kind of job that will be fairly common over the next 10 years. Then maybe it'll go away.
Talking about jobs, some of your articles, you were talking about how, I believe it was like the AP Sports, whatever writing team has been using AI writing tools for well over a decade, where you're kind of just taking some sport scores and some stats and then just kind of reconfiguring into an article fairly easy. And then you mentioned that you had, you're talking about the singer John Lennon, where people were taking old John Lennon recordings and then they were just running it through, quote unquote AI voice software, which is just like a feature of like, Final Cut Pro or
Yeah, it's about as
Adobe.
sophisticated as Photoshop. It's not really AI.
Right, it's not AI, right, and it's a lot of things aren't AI. And then you basically have a quote from, was it John Naughton, who has a big science writer, but he basically says that all this iteration of ChatGPT reminds him of is spreadsheet software.
Yeah, right. You're right. Excel.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and like
He
Excel.
says that.
And with Excel, I mean, you have macros, which would have been "quote unquote" AI 20 years ago, right? Or 30 years ago at this point.
Yeah, 30. A friend of mine that lives near me had a company 30 years ago that made macros, pre-made macros, and he sold those as software and made a good amount of money. Nowadays, that's something you can do with a couple pushes of a button, and there's probably an AI that could make macros for you if you tell it what the macro's for and which buttons you want to have to push. If you write a good prompt, the AI could make that.
So, Kevin, how long ago when did you leave your professor job at the you were at the New York Institute of Technology, correct?
Right. It's like a small, sort of more regional version of MIT.
Of MIT, right? And when did you leave? When did you leave New York Institute of Technology?
I left in 2021, 4 years ago.
Right. So say somewhat recent. So I mean, so ChatGPT came out, I believe, was at November 2022. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's right.
So, but I mean, like I had David Sachs on, not the David Sachs who's on the All In podcast, but the David Sachs, the author who wrote a book, something about talking about how we're going to go back to analog. He had a line which I thought was funny, but basically he's like, I have kids. He's like, everyone says that these kids are really good at technology. He's like, my kids spend all day like playing Candy Crush. Like, just because you're on your phone all day or your computer all day doesn't mean you're some like coding savant or some like, just because you're digital native doesn't mean you actually know how to do anything. I mean, like, so, I mean, I would imagine
the same thing. I said the same thing 20 years ago. I'd go to a party and people would say, "Oh, you work with technology?" I said, "Yeah." They would say stuff like, "Your students must be brilliant at technology." And I'd say, "Well, they're brilliant at, using social media and at playing games, but they don't know how to use anything useful." Like I said, I teach business writing is one of the things I used to teach. And I have to teach them how to use Microsoft templates in Microsoft Word. They don't even know what templates are. And so I say, write a resume by next class. They'll go, "Oh my God, I can't do that. I don't know how to write a resume." And I say, "Just use a template and fill it in." And they go, "What's that?" And so I'd have to show them up on the screen, "Okay, here's Microsoft Word. When you start a new document, just click on templates." And there's a whole bunch of resumes. So anyway, that was an example I always used at parties, that they didn't know how to use useful things. Like my nieces are really good if you need to know something about how to use your iPhone to do texting, right? Like, how do you get yourself out of a group when there are too many texts coming down the pipe at you? That's something they can show somebody like me, because I don't text all that much, right? But to use a program, like a software program, that's for business or productivity, not so much.
And was this going on when you were at the New York Institute of Technology? These are the students you're talking about? So these are students that are like engineers and like computer scientists, right? I mean, these are people that you would consider that are like tech savvy at the very. It's not like you got a music, like art history major or something that maybe you think is a little bit more, abstract thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it was unpredictable who would be good at productive technology and who wasn't. The computer science majors, a lot of them, they only knew how to do what they were taught to do in computer science classes, like how to write code or how to, develop a particular type of software, how to use Unity coding software to write an augmented reality program. But they didn't know how to use something like Microsoft Word, because that wasn't important to their major. And then on the other hand, I have English majors who are really good at using more general technology like Microsoft Word because they had to write a lot. So anyway, it was really unpredictable. One of my best students ever was an English major at a tech university who's now an actress. She's in Star Trek. The new Star Trek that's on Paramount Plus has 2 seasons. Melissa Navia, she plays the helmsman in so I think it's called Where No Person Has Gone Before or something like that. Anyway, she was brilliant and she could do all that, anything you asked her to do, she'd figure it out, and she'd figure it out fast. And she wasn't a tech person, technically speaking.
We're talking about AI ethics. So what is like the biggest area that you see on the forefront where we're going to have major questions of AI ethics? In your article that I'm referencing, you're talking about Elon Musk and the neural lace, which I never knew, which was a company before, and then he bought it and kind of changed the name to Neuralink. You, of course, mentioned Elon Musk before with the self-driving cars, and Elon Musk isn't the only player in this space. Of course, we have generative AI, we have predictive AI. So there's a lot of different kind of categories of AI. You mentioned surveillance, which could be used with, kind of AI imaging, et cetera. So what are, in the next, say, like 5 years, what are some of the biggest areas of concern when it comes to AI? Like, to me, reading about like the Neuralink, it seems like that's quite a bit more than 5 years off, at least if you're talking about a larger subset of the population. What are you worried about in the next 5 years?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue right now is data privacy. These companies that train their AIs train it on stolen data, scraped off the internet from you and me. I have 2 books online at Google Books, and Google Books allows you to read, I'd say probably 70% of the book. So if they were able to access that, AI trainers would simply scrape my book off the internet to train their AI with. And all the articles that you said you referenced, those are also available. And, I don't make a lot of money on those, but I sure would like the chance to make some money on those. The little bit I get is worth preserving. So anyway, I think that's a problem for everybody, but there are ethical data providers just coming up now because they believe the same thing. They think, first, there's an ethical way to do this, which is buy people's data, pay them for it, and then sell it to an AI company. So the guy whose podcast I was on, Tartle.com, Alexander McKeag, he's doing that with his startup, and they're being very successful so far. They're here in the business incubator here in Santa Fe. So anyway, that's something that's got to happen. Finding ethical ways to obtain data from people and then to use that data to train your AI. And that's an immediate problem. Other problems, like you mentioned, surveillance, facial recognition, all of that has the possibility of being inhumane. For instance, the Chinese are using it to control the Uyghur population in China, which, as you know, they're Turkish ethnically, and it's very oppressive, the kind of surveillance they live under. And that is going to be augmented by AI. And the Chinese have no regulations whatsoever. They don't want to, I don't think, because they want to be able to use it however they see fit. The other thing is just instituting regulations about these kinds of things is going to be difficult and is very important in the near future. The new presidential regime just came in and cut Biden's executive order, reversed it, to have some regulations. And they weren't even very strict because they were voluntary regulations that were made up by the AI companies themselves, if you read the document, which I did. And it's all sort of, good basic stuff about data ethics and so forth, but now it's gone. So the United States has absolutely nothing in terms of regulation of AI. And we have the most advanced AI, and we're most likely to advance it to the point where it's dangerous quickly. I mean, what I tell people is, how would you like it if we didn't have any nuclear regulation? None. Just imagine we'd have all these little countries having the, atomic bombs. You'd have people, other people around the world building nuclear generators without following any kind of, regulation for safety, et cetera. And we're doing that with AI. We're just ignoring the regulatory aspects, except for the EU, which, as somebody from the EU told me once, the EU is always good at regulating. The United States is good at creating, and the Chinese are good at stealing, and so, or borrowing, in the case of DeepSeek.
I mean, like you're talking about regulation. I think the AI in any country is so far off from having like this Terminator or Total Recall moment, though. At the same time, like these are large language models. It's not like some super advanced AI. I think the fact that because it speaks to people, or in the form of regular text, people think it's a lot smarter than it is. I mean, you mentioned about like the lawyer cases, right? A lawyer goes to prepare for a case, uses ChatGPT. Every case is made up.
Yeah,
and
all the
like
precedents.
Right, and the fact is, the guy didn't even double. Like honestly, like that guy should be like disbarred.
Yeah,
But I mean, and like I read the book, was it AI as Snake Oil or something like that? I believe it was two Princeton professors wrote that, and like they're fairly high on generative AI, but they're very low on predictive AI. And predictive AI, where you're having like kids taken out of homes, put into foster care based on certain metrics, or you're having people either taken out of a hospital early or whatever due to certain metrics that the predictive AI has used and things like that. So I mean, those are, I guess, more concerns I have, because like a lot of these things, like I mean, everyone has experienced the predictive AI with a job application. Like you have you apply for a job, and no person is reading that the resume. It's an AI. So what people back in the day, they would have the resume. They would put like, oh, I went to Harvard, I went to Yale, I went to Stanford, I went to Princeton, in white text. And then they would, above the white text, they would, they're just gaming the system, right? Then in black text, they would put their actual resume, because the AI would read
the keywords.
The keywords. Like that was the same thing back in the day with blogging, right? When you wanted to be number one on Google, you would put back in white text in the back of the blog, like, number one website for selling, fishing gear, or selling mountain bikes, or whatever, whatever it was. But like, a lot of these people are, I guess you could say that like there's a lot of kind of predictive AI now that has a lot of ethical considerations.
Yeah, I mean, you used to be able to. This is like 20 years ago. You used to be able to hire somebody that did SEO, search engine optimization, and they would have you put in keywords to optimize where you appeared on a Google search, gaming the system, like you said. Now, with AI doing the initial job screening, you got to know what keywords to put in your resume, or you're not getting a second, even an interview. So those are issues I think are dangerous for people in the job world. And yes, the Terminator scenario is very unlikely for a lot of reasons. But there are some problems, like the US, the Pentagon, and DoD, and the equivalent organizations in other countries are trying to optimize AI for use as a weapon. So, they've already got that kind of thing that's being used at a low grade. Like, here, for instance, there are machine guns on the border between North and South Korea, installed by the South Koreans, that are completely automated. They can identify somebody coming across the border. They can identify whether he or she has a gun, and they can warn the person that if they don't put their hands up and drop the gun, it's going to shoot and kill them. And then if they don't obey, it shoots to kill. And it can do all of that by itself. But so far, because of ethical concerns, the South Korean government demands what's called the man in the middle, somebody to get an alert that there's an incursion at the border, and then the human makes a decision whether or not to shoot, although the AI gun can do it itself. So there's lots of those kinds of things. And drones. I mean, right now in Ukraine, the drones are all run by human beings, but if they could run it by AI, they could be much more efficient. You could have one human run like 10, 20 drones by simply sending it code to have it do what you want it to do and then letting them go. Same thing with fighter jets. They're trying to completely automate those, so you don't need a human being who can only stand so many G forces on their body before they pass out. If you had something that was like an AI-operated jet, you could fly the heck out of the plane, and in a dogfight, you'd win because the automated plane could do things that a human-piloted plane can't. So anyway, those are some examples where I think AI can be dangerous, and it's all in the weapons department. And there are other dangers with AI, some more mundane ones like privacy matters. So those things need to be regulated.
What's the most outlandish thing you've heard that could become reality with AI?
Outlandish?
Mm-hmm. But crazy, just kind of far out there, whatever terminology you want to use.
I would say Neuralinks, Neuralink, Synchron, and Kernel are the three big companies working on brain-computer interfaces, or BCI, as it's known. Elon Musk, okay, so the person who developed neural lace, which is Musk's name for it, was a scientist at Harvard named Charles Lieber. He and his team, about 6 years ago, developed this prototype where, you have basically lace unveiling in your brain, and the lace forms a Wi-Fi antenna, and then you can communicate back and forth with the human brain. You can download information from the brain, and you can implant information. They did that stuff with rats and monkeys, but they had to drill a hole and they had to do it because they hadn't gotten far enough yet with it. Then Musk and his company, Neuralink, bought the patent rights, and they had planned on doing it. Lieber, if you read Lieber's article about this, which I have, at the very end of the article, in the last paragraph, he says, what we foresee being able to do is taking this fine mesh, which is only a couple microns thick, putting it in a syringe, injecting it in the carotid artery, and it travels to the brain and unveils itself, right? There's no, as far as they know, they did that without the carotid artery. They just dumped it in the brain of rats and monkeys. There was no side effects. So if they could do that, if Musk gets to the point where they can just inject it with a syringe, and it doesn't have any side effects, then you have humans who are augmented by whatever digital devices they have external to their body. So you can think faster, have much more memory. You're basically become superhuman. His idea is that you'd be able to compete with AI because he thinks that AI is going to put us out of jobs and maybe force us off the planet. And his plan B after BCI, his plan B is to move to Mars, to get away from all of our AI. But it's not really a very comforting option. So anyway, I think that's probably the wildest one because he goes from saying we could connect with, computers and AI and so forth and be digitally enhanced. And he also says with another human, we could talk telepathically if we both had Wi-Fi antennas. You and I could communicate, do this whole thing in about 3 seconds, and we'd be done.
When I was reading that article, one of the first things that popped into my mind was Ozempic. I had a podcast with a former official for a Yale fellow who also worked for the Biden administration's agricultural department. And he was saying that in the future, he thinks that we'll have a divided society in the U.S. between those that can afford Ozempic and those that cannot. And my aspersion was, well, I'm not like, maybe I'll just like use willpower and eat less food and not turn into a fat ass instead of having to inject myself with some drug. And then of course, I was reading articles that were talking about a lot of health effects, having cancers, half the body weight was muscle mass, and which is just really wrecking your metabolism and things like that. Plus you're just like going to be dependent on this drug. And then I was thinking the same thing, like, yeah, maybe you get this BCI, this implantable BCI, Neuralink, Neuralace, whatever you want to call it. And then all of a sudden now you're having some health issues. And like, it's like what was like the movie with Bradley Cooper, where he took the pill that made him smarter.
Yeah,
limitless, right? And
there's also one from a Philip K. Dick novel called Minority Report with
Tom Cruise.
Tom
right?
Cruise,
yeah,
and similar kind of thing. Enhanced humans to do particular jobs.
But yeah, it's like if your body's there's a reason like elite athletes constantly have injuries. It's like a Ferrari. If you want a reliable car, you get like a Honda Civic or something. You don't go bust out a Lambo. You hit a pothole and you got a 2-inch clearance. That pothole is gonna F that car up. Some things are built for speed. Other things are built for endurance. I guess I'm not. When you're maybe 35 and you're too lazy to do the work, maybe you want to take some shortcut, but you're gonna be paying for that down the road. I guess I tend to like, if people want to do brain implants, I'm all in favor of it. I personally think 10 years, 15 years from now, they're going to be having second thoughts on that.
Well, that's what you brought up, an issue that's one of the other important issues, I think. It's called distributive justice in the ethical world. And that means when you get a new thing, how are you going to make sure everybody in society can get it, not just rich people? And that's a big issue, because you're right. Neuralink implants would cost tens of thousands of dollars, probably. Who's going to pay for that? In the end of my article that you read, I point out that a guy named Veit, V-E-I-T, he theorizes that businesses would pay for that because it would enhance productivity so much for their workers. Okay, so who maintains it once that worker leaves that company? There's all kinds of what ifs, and you're right. All of them, the more far out things like Neuralace, they present even bigger problems than the smaller steps we've taken with AI. In fact, I just proposed talking at a conference in Portugal it's a sports conference about AI in sports, talking about mental enhancement using Neuralace and that kind of thing as an example. And yeah, it could enhance athletes, just like taking EPO enhances an athlete's physical abilities. But then is that fair to people who can't afford an implant? Is it, who's going to pay for it? Do only the richer countries get those kinds of implants? Is it going to be legal? They made EPO illegal in worldwide sports because it gives you an unfair advantage. So all kinds of issues come up.
In that same article we're talking about, I'm just going to kind of read mostly what you say, paraphrase a little bit, but you basically talk about, you say this is already happening in China, which is monitoring I can't say the word, monitoring data from some employees' brains by forcing them to wear caps outfitted with sensors while they work. These sensor arrays can scan their brain waves for emotional disturbances and send that data to their bosses. This procedure is taking place for 3 types of Chinese workers: telecommunication, factory workers, high-speed train drivers, and military workers. And then you basically say that there's this one company that uses this arrangement according to information provided by a name I can't pronounce. Workers on their production lines all wear caps or sensors that monitor their brain waves, and then management feeds that data into algorithms that allow AI to recommend changes, such as adjusting the pace of production and redesign workflows. And this, I believe I think this article was from 2024, but that to me just this is something you'd see in some dystopian movie. And then China, of course, has with the CCP, more of an authoritarian regime. It's got, allegedly 1.4 billion people. I mean, some people say it's more like 800 million, but the fact is you have somewhere around a billion people. So they could, I would imagine Chinese AI will be significantly superior to the US just because they have significantly more data, which at this point, big data is a big part of training these models, etc. But this opens up all sorts of dystopian kind of scenarios. And when you were just mentioning about, this Neuralink, I mean, for employers who would pay for it, well, if the employer paid for it, they'd lock you into some 10-year contract. You basically, it'd be just some, you go back to being some feudal employee, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are already things called non-compete clauses that people have to sign when they go with a particular company. My wife had to sign one. And that meant that if she tried to move to another company, she had to wait a year or 2 years before moving, which could bankrupt you. It's just a completely unfair treatment of employees. I can see the business point of view of that too. They don't want somebody taking knowledge from their business to another competitor and so forth. But I mean, come on. Let's get real. People have to make a living. Now in China, you're talking about Hongzheng Electric Company, where they made everybody wear the caps and on assembly lines, if I remember right. And yeah, I mean, that seems pretty dystopian. That's why I put it in the article. And by the way, that all came from a Chinese newspaper, the South China Gazette, I think it is. So they were proud of this because they allowed it to be publicized. I'm not so sure how Westerners would feel about that. We're not in at least as of now, we're not in a command economy where somebody can just tell you, you got to make this and you're going to have to wear this cap and you got no choice if you want a job. So yeah, where this stuff goes makes me nervous.
Yeah, because basically, you say, it's in this article, I'm talking about Neuralink, but you say basically, if let's just say the price comes down, everyone feels compelled to have it. Well, then you're talking about, well, if our thoughts become easily transmittable digitally, as Elon Musk envisions, what does that mean for the privacy of those thoughts, right? Because all of a sudden now,
exactly,
then we're going to have an Inception scenario or Total Recall, where now we're just going to take what you're thinking and inverse it. So now we're going to tell you what you're thinking. I mean, I think this stuff could be. I mean, hopefully, at least I don't see it in my lifetime. Maybe that's being selfish, but I don't want to see this stuff. But we could be talking about because the fact is people, you're going to have, all it takes is one mad scientist to go crazy with this stuff. And you could really mess with, you could mess with billions of people, or at least certainly millions of people.
Yeah. I mean, to the key thing that is a fly in the ointment for people that want to develop stuff like that is that even if you're a mad scientist, you need funding. Where are you going to get that funding? The companies that give funds to things, they have ethical departments, that sort of vet these projects. A good example is somebody I was talking to earlier today who is part of a Spanish institute about technology, right? They're being funded by Google to do a research project. They're going to interview me tomorrow private just to get data. And so Google is paying for this. And because they have deep pockets, they can give these guys as much money as they want. Now it's pretty harmless. They're trying to look at the future of jobs with AI, which I wrote a book about, or put together a book about. So that's why they want to talk to me. And they want me to make all these predictions. They sent me a list of questions. And I'm not sure I have a crystal ball about these things, but I can say with pretty good certainty about the future that it'll probably be 20 years before we get a lot of jobs out of AI. because that's what it took with previous industrial revolution. So history predicts the future pretty well as compared to somebody like me just making stuff up off the top of my head.
If you look at any like graph of like IQ, I mean, IQ has gone, like say college graduates, it's gone down from like 115 in the 60s to something like 102 now, which is barely above average. And now you essentially are having people just kind of like outsource their thinking to AI. And so, where's like critical thinking come into this? And you're talking about like, hey, let's just say you have this Neuralink and it's like, you're thinking like, oh, I can't remember this movie name. Oh, it's Total Recall. Well, that doesn't really make you any smarter in terms of the ability to think and problem solve. It just allows you to think of a movie, but you understand what the movie was about. You kind of have the context to it. You just can't like, oh, what's that actor's name? Oh, it's Matthew McConaughey. If you couldn't think of it, like you Google it, oh, Matthew, like honestly, like to me, when you're like, it bothers you, like, oh, I can't think of that actor. Like you Google it, all of a sudden now the whole train of thought that you had is now lost anyways. Yeah. So like a lot of these tools aren't necessarily, making you smart. It may maybe make you sound smarter because you can come up with that name, but the thought process is the actual important part. And none of these things are helping you actually think more critically. They're not allowing you to kind of think outside the box. If anything, you're going to just have more of this like kind of mainstream narrative, or at least more of the quote unquote like consensus view, which I'm not sure how that allows things to bloom and develop. If that's what we're all going to have the same consensus view because we have this technology all telling us the same thing.
Yep, I agree. I mean, just because you can think faster doesn't mean you think better. And primarily what inventions like AI involved technology like Neuralink will speed up your recall of things and make your memory better because it'll supply it for you. But I could do that with this. I mean, when I'm at a conference, I use this under the table to do exactly what you said, which is I'll go, oh, what was the name of that scholar who wrote the book on Wired for War? And I just type it in here under the table, and within seconds, I've got the name, and I sound like I'm really smart. Or I talk a lot about Aristotle, the ideas about slaves and about making artificial slaves 2,000 years ago, which is the beginning, at least I say so in my first book, the beginning of the idea of intelligent servants that are artificial. So I can say, well, that's in section 1253A and to 1253B. Now, I've memorized that because I say it so much, but the first time I said it at a conference, I did this to Google my own book and to see what section I was talking about in the book. And there you go. And I didn't need a link to the internet from my head. So how do I put it? The marginal utility of having a Wi-Fi antenna in your brain, I think, is far less than people would imagine. And the negative consequences are far more than people might imagine. Expense. What if first of all, other neurologists have told me that the thing that is not talked about by Lieber and Neuralink is that when you put this neural mesh in your head, your body attacks it and dissolves it within about 6 months. So you'd have to repeatedly put this antenna into your head. How many people want to do that? And then you'd have to pay repeatedly to have that surgery done. So, I mean, there's all kinds of downsides that you could say are a lot more consequential than the upsides, like you were just saying.
Yeah, I mean, Elon Musk has a famous quote where he says, "We are already a cyborg. We are so well connected with our phones and computers that losing a phone feels like losing a limb." And of course,
I agree.
Elon Musk, I personally don't think that I didn't have a smartphone until like 2016. I guess I'm 42. And I'm a lot older.
Yeah,
you're a lot older. And I live in a college town, and there's plenty of people that just don't have any desire to really be on their phone, because you go to college, you go to class, you're on your phone or your tablet or computer all day. But I think there's a big leap between being on your phone and having some implant put into your brain as well. I mean, that's a massive a massive leap. But to me, like if you are without your phone and you feel like you're losing a limb, I mean, I think maybe you need to reevaluate, maybe some choices that you make and how you go about critically thinking throughout your day.
I've given talks on this all over the place. And one of the questions people have asked me is, can you put a kill switch on the BCI so you can just turn it off? And I said, they haven't talked about that in the research yet. So I don't know. But it's a good question, isn't it?
And one of the articles you're talking about, I believe, is the one with Elon Musk. You're talking about some of these movies. You had Total Recall, where basically Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's in that, he accidentally finds out that everything he remembers, his whole past, is a false memory. Right. You talked about, was it Blade Runner, which I believe is a book that was based on like I Dream of Electric Sheep. Is that right? So you talk about
Android's Dream of Electric Sheep.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so you talk about some of these science fiction novels and science fiction movies. What science fiction novel or movie are we kind of either currently living in now, or we're going to be living in the next 5-10 years? What's the most realistic? What movie, book, science fiction did the best job of predicting our current situation?
Okay, well, I think the best one for the future situation, given how we're using AI now, and then I'll go back to your question. The one for the best predictor of the future is a novel by a guy named Morgan. He's a British guy called Altered Carbon. And it was made into a series by Netflix. I think it was Netflix or it was Amazon. Anyway, it was on a couple years ago, maybe 4 years ago. And it makes these pretty dire predictions, very believable ones, about how using technology to enhance ourselves will lead to all kinds of social dislocations, especially including a bigger and bigger gap between the haves and the have-nots. So I think that's what's going to happen if we don't start regulating it. And if you read Altered Carbon, you'll see what I mean. You can watch the show, but all the information goes by so fast in the show that I actually had to pause it and think, oh, that's this part of the novel, and this is happening. So I'd recommend reading the novel. Anyway, as for current situation, sort of an exaggerated version of today's situation is Blade Runner. I mean, the book, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, I talk about this in the article about how in the beginning of the book, in the first 10 pages, the main character, Rick Deckard, and his wife have an argument. And they didn't have buttons back then for things. They had dials. So they're arguing and they say, don't you dare dial 2 to make yourself more obstinate, or I'll dial 6 to make myself more stubborn. And so they're using computers to dial in moods. It's called the mood organ. They can't do it themselves. So they've actually lost some of their humanity because they rely so heavily on artificial intelligence to do stuff for them. And that, by the way, goes all the way back to a prediction made by not von Neumann, but Norbert Wiener, who was like the father of computing back in the 40s and 50s, and an incredibly brilliant guy. He wrote in his first book called The Human Use of Human Beings, which is an odd title considering he's talking about intelligent technology. He said the biggest threat to us is that we'll start using intelligent technology and relying on it to make decisions for us. And that's going to lead to disaster. And I see that happening now.
And what's the biggest area you see that happening in now?
Well, we use AI daily, AI or intelligent technology, to give us advice on what we should eat, where we should eat, Yelp, for instance, or to give us advice on what furniture to buy and so forth. Those may seem like insignificant decisions, but that's just a start.
Since we're talking about TV shows or movies, films, etc., have you ever seen the TV show Severance on Apple?
Yeah, I watched the first season.
Yeah, and I mean the second season just came out. I think they're 2 episodes in. But what's kind of your thought on that in terms of AI?
Yeah, what's interesting is that doesn't really have a lot to do with AI. In the first season, they do something to the brain. They cut a nerve or something that allows memory of what you did when you're at work. And then similarly, you can't remember what you did at home when you're at work. So the separation is between your consciousness at work and your consciousness at home. I suppose AI could figure into that if we're talking about nowadays in real life. If we start using AI as an aid to do a lot of our work, we're going to start living in the world of AI a lot, especially at work. And then we go home. How are we going to disengage from that? What's it called? Separation? The show. It presents a possibility for that.
Well, Severance.
And Severance, thank you.
Yeah.
And here's the thing. I actually promote the idea of using AI as an addendum for boosting human productivity and abilities in simple ways, like being able to write a document. I think it's great that you can tell ChatGPT, give me a one-page outline for a business plan, being an AI ethics consultant, and it'll do it within 3 seconds. And then, so that would save me like an hour and a half of work. And then I would go in and revise it, which is the real work. But it would cut my writing time in half because ChatGPT and large language models are really good at coming up with smooth prose and initial ideas. Beyond that, it's not as good. So that still speeds up and aids humans doing things that are important to them. So I guess I'm kind of self-contradictory here that I worry about using AI too much, but yet I promote using AI to be an aid for work in smaller ways.
Yeah, I mean, because you're talking about basically kind of the ethical use of AI. So AI is not bad to use. It's just, I guess, the context, the development, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. There's a difference between having AI do all your work and having AI start something and you finish the project, because then it's yours if you finish it. How much finishing work is necessary? That's up in the air. It depends how simple the task is. Doing something like writing a business plan for me isn't that complicated because there are other people who do what I do. So it has data for that. If I were doing something more complex, like imagine you're an astronaut. I'm writing the prompt here in my head. Imagine you're an astronaut and you have to calculate exactly how much fuel to expend between Earth and the moon to get there in a space capsule made by SpaceX. That's a complicated task because there are unknowns in there. And I'm assuming I'd probably get the AI would say something like, I'm sorry, I can't do that because I don't have information that I need to do it.
So Kevin, I said we go for an hour. So let's get to the final question. Let people know where they can get a hold of you or whatever information that you want to share. Secondly, just leave us with a final thought related to this podcast or whatever you're working on next or whatever's on your mind.
Okay, well, you can get a hold of me at LinkedIn. I have my email address there, and I'm on LinkedIn. You can see a lot of the stuff I'm working on there. And if you're more interested in the publications, including the academic ones that you were brave enough to read, you can find those on a website called academia.edu. You just type in my name and that web address, and it'll come up with lists of stuff that I've published, and you can read it, most of it, online. As for a final thought, I guess I'd like to say what I always say, which is AI is extremely promising for the human race, but we have to be judicious and careful about how we use it. And I don't think we're doing that yet. So a lot of promise, but we have to monitor the ethics of what we do.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.